Hello, this is the Code War, and we are looking at the Berlin airlift. The Berlin airlift followed immediately after the Berlin blockade, which was effected by Stalin of Soviet Union, if you remember very clearly. And the Berlin airlift, the main purpose was for the Western Allied powers. They wanted to declare or to show their stand, to show their position as far as the Berlin blockade was concerned. They wanted to show their commitment to Berlin, and they wanted to show that they were not going to give up on Berlin despite Stalin of USSR putting a blockade in Berlin. After the Berlin airlift, where the Western Allied powers were airlifting supplies to Berlin to feed the people of Berlin after the blockade, they were using the planes, and this forced Stalin of Soviet Union to open the communication lines which he had closed. And this showed that Stalin had accepted defeat. He had accepted failure or defeat in his Berlin blockade program. However, as we move on, we see that the Berlin airlift made a lot of people from Berlin to move to other places. They moved from other places, and after this airlift, we see quite a number of consequences, or we see quite a number of results as a result of the division between the Western Allied powers and Stalin of Soviet Union. Let's see the consequences, or let's look at the consequences of the Berlin blockade. Berlin blockade followed by Berlin airlift had quite a number of consequences, or there were results. There was an impact that followed the blockade. And which were some of these results? Let's see some of the results or consequences of the Berlin blockade, which was followed by Berlin airlift. Number one, German became a divided power. Because on one side there was German under Stalin, and on the other side there was German under the Western Allied powers. And this division of German into two units, or into two parts, lasted for over 40 years. German remained a divided entity into two for over a period of 40 years. Consequence number two of the Berlin blockade, which was instituted by Stalin, was that Berlin, after the Berlin blockade and after the Berlin airlift, remained a symbol of power. It remained a symbol of power in history. And this was significant. It was a significant symbol of the tensions that were there during the Cold War. It was a significant symbol of the tensions of the Cold War. And number three, apart from being a symbol of power, or a symbol of the Cold War tensions, it was also a flashpoint. Berlin became a potential flashpoint, and this made it very clear to the world that the worries of both USSR and USA about Berlin, their worries concerning Berlin would definitely affect any of their policies that they would make in the rest of the world. And number four, consequence number four, the Berlin blockade helped to set out a pattern. It helped to set out a clear pattern of the Cold War confrontations. It was very clear, and anybody could be able to follow on the pattern or on the events that had led to the confrontations of the Cold War. And on one hand, the two superpowers, that is USSR and USA, together with their allies, or together with those powers who were on their support side, had shown how suspicious they were of each other and how they could not trust each other. On the other hand, however, each of these superpowers had clearly indicated that they were not willing to enter into war with one another. Remember, it was after First World War, after Second World War, and the memories, the losses, the damages, and the effects of the wars were still fresh in the minds of the superpowers. None of these superpowers wanted to be engaged into any further. The Berlin blockade thus, or therefore, it set out a tense balance, or there was tension between the superpowers. It was significant in setting out a tense balance, or rather there was hostility, suspicion between the superpowers, and this was characteristic, or it was one of the main characteristics of the Cold War period. Remember, the Cold War period started after Second World War, after the defeat of Hitler Germany, and it lasted all the way up to 1989. Number five, apart from Berlin blockade being significant in setting out the pattern of Cold War tensions, it was out of the blockade in Berlin by Stalin which saw the formation of NATO. NATO was formed by the Western powers when they met in Washington, and they entered into an agreement, or into a pact of working together. It was at the height of the Berlin blockade where the Western powers felt that they needed to come together and form an agreement together with their allies and promise or pledge to each other to support each other and to work as one entity or as one body. NATO read to Stalin, or to USSR and other communist states in Eastern Europe, such as Poland, East Germany, Romania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. They formed, in retaliation or in return, the communist powers together with USSR formed the Warsaw Pact. They formed the Warsaw Pact alliance. In this alliance, they pledged to defend each other if any of them was attacked. They promised to not interfere in the internal affairs of each other, but they promised to defend each other in case of war or in case of tensions with other powers. The NATO, however, was very important, or it was an important development, because it made the Americans to abandon their policy of no entangling alliances, or their policy of not interfering in world affairs. And it was during this time when they met as Western powers and came up or formed the NATO that they pledged even to give each other military support, or to help each other defend themselves. So this was significant to America, for it was a show of how they could not keep to their isolation policy or policy of not interfering in the world affairs. And finally, it's about the nuclear powers, about Americans' expedition on armaments. It was tripled, or the funding for armament, for example, in America, to fight off against communism, against communist powers like Russia, China, and Korea, was tripled. In short, those are some of the consequences of the Berlin blockade. And you can see a summary there. Yeah.